The winter of 1898 arrived in France like a beast with no mercy, slipping across the fields and townships with the certainty of something ancient and unstoppable. Snow had fallen before, of course. Snow was no stranger to the mountains of the Vosges or the windy plains near Picardy. But this year felt different from the very first gust. The cold descended in a way that felt personal, as though the sky itself had grown bitter and chose to punish the earth below. In the small village of Saint-Marceau, nestled between the frost-stiff vineyards of eastern France, families had already begun shuttering windows and layering blankets long before December had even arrived. The older villagers whispered that this sort of cold had not been seen in their lifetimes, nor in their fathers, nor, as one elderly man claimed, since the year Napoleon marched east. Their breath curled from their lips like smoke as they spoke, as though even their words turned to frost. At the very edge of Saint-Marceau, in a stone cottage half buried by snowdrifts, lived a girl named Clara Morel, 15 years old and old enough to sense that the world around her was beginning to shake. Her father, Etienne, was a cooper, one of the few craftsmen still working despite the shortages. Her mother, Jacqueline, tended to a modest small holding behind their cottage, though the vegetables had withered long before winter had even begun its assault. On this night, the night that would mark the beginning of a story Clara would remember for the rest of her life, the wind was howling against the shutters with the fury of wolves. The fire in their hearth popped and cracked like gunfire, leaving sparks cascading upward like tiny meteors. Clara sat on the worn rug before the flames, her wool shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders as she stitched a tear in her father's coat. It was a simple, domestic scene, one found in many homes across France, but beneath it pulsed a quiet tension. Beyond the village, armies were moving. Rumors carried on the wind, whispers of troop buildups along borders, of diplomats failing to reach agreements, of alliances shifting like the ice on the river. France was no stranger to conflict, its borders had known the march of boots too many times to count. But this time felt heavier, more uncertain. And Clara, young though she was, felt that heaviness in her bones. Etienne sat at the table with two other men from the village, Henri Duval, a blacksmith with arms like tree trunks, and Mathieu Renaud, a quiet widower who rarely smiled anymore. They leaned in close under the dim oil lamp, their voices hushed but intense. Clara pretended not to listen, though her needle paused mid-stitch. "They say the Germans are preparing for something," Henri muttered, rubbing a thick hand over his beard. "Not a skirmish. Not a border dispute. Something larger." Jacqueline, while stirring a pot of boiling barley at the hearth, cast a worried glance their way. "We cannot leap to fear every time the winds carry rumor." "Rumor or not," Henri replied, "the soldiers moving through Lyon last month were not sent merely for exercise." Matthew's voice came low, like a man confessing something to a priest. "My cousin in Reims wrote last week. He said they've begun stockpiling medicines, ammunition, blankets, powder. Something is coming." Clara looked down at the coat in her hands, the frayed fabric suddenly seeming like a metaphor for the world around her, patched too many times, worn thin, barely holding together. The wind slammed against the walls again, rattling the shutters like skeletal fingers. Jacqueline crossed herself reflexively, though she murmured no prayer. "It's the cold," she said softly. "This winter is cruel. It puts dark thoughts in men's minds." Etienne stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Cruel winters have preceded cruel years." The three men fell quiet. Even the fire paused its crackling, as though the flames themselves listened. Though the night was bitter, Clara could not sleep. Her bed felt too cold, her blanket too thin, and her thoughts too loud. She sensed changes in her parents, the conversations they stopped when she entered the room, the letters folded too quickly, the tightness around her mother's eyes. Something troubled them far more than the snow. Quietly, she slipped out of bed, lit only by the pale moonlight reflecting off the frozen lake in the distance. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and tiptoed to the small window overlooking the village. The view below was a painting of stillness, the church steeple dusted white, the rooftops buried, the single lamppost flickering weakly against the cold. But there was movement, too, shadows shifting near old Madame Lefebvre's barn. A lantern bobbed. Then another. Then a third. A small gathering. At this hour? Her breath halted. She recognized one of the figures, Captain Auguste Valliere, a retired officer who had fought years ago in a forgotten conflict along the Rhine. His posture was unmistakable, even in silhouette, shoulders straight, chin raised, body poised like a man still listening for distant artillery. He rarely emerged these days, except when something serious stirred the quiet of Saint-Marceau. And if Auguste Valliere was gathering men under moonlight in the dead of winter, it meant whatever the adults whispered about was not rumor at all. Morning came reluctantly, the sky a bruised purple as the sun fought through the icy haze. Clara helped her mother break the layer of ice that had formed inside the water bucket overnight, inside, not outside. That was how cold the world had grown. The village square, usually echoing with the sounds of merchants, children, and wagons, felt eerily muted. A handful of men huddled outside the general store, stamping their feet to keep blood running. Clara overheard fragments of conversation. Letters from Paris. Mobilization orders. The government denies. But soldiers are already. Every few words made her heart grip tighter. At noon, a thin figure approached from the road, a postal courier, scarf wrapped up to his nose, burdened by a satchel so full that the leather bulged. He stopped in the center of the square, lifted a bundle of envelopes, and called names. When Clara heard Etienne Morel, the air froze in her chest. Her father stepped forward, took the letter, and held it as though it were heavier than iron. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he scanned the square, then motioned for his family to follow him home. Inside their cottage, Etienne finally broke the seal. Clara watched the blood drain from his face. Jacqueline pressed a hand to her mouth. No. He folded the letter with trembling hands and placed it on the table. It has begun, he said. Clara's pulse thudded. What has begun? Etienne looked at her, and for the first time in her life, she saw fear in his eyes. War. The days that followed were a blur of activity. Men gathered in barns, storage rooms, and under awnings to read the notices posted by the courier. The French government insisted that conflict could still be avoided, but the call for regional readiness spoke louder than the officials' reassurances. Saint-Marceau transformed. Even the cold could not pause the frenzy. Henri worked day and night forging tools and repairing wagon wheels. Mathieu gathered wool, grain, and dried herbs from families willing to donate supplies. Captain Valliere trained several young men in the basics of discipline, marching drills, hand signals, even how to reinforce trenches with timber. But as always, it was the mothers, daughters, and grandmothers who felt the first wounds of war. Food grew scarcer. Firewood disappeared faster than it could be chopped. And the cold, relentless as a vulture, fed on the weakest. No one said it aloud, but the village had already lost 2 elderly residents to the freeze. Clara moved through the days like someone trapped between childhood and the demands of a world unraveling. She carried water, mended clothes, stirred soup so thin she could see the bottom of the pot. More than once she saw her mother quietly wiping tears while scrubbing pans or folding linens, thinking no one noticed. At night, Clara lay awake listening to the snowflakes whisper against the roof like spirits tapping to be let in. Was war already creeping toward them? Would her father be taken away? Would soldiers march through their fields? Would the world she knew crumble like frost in a warm hand? One evening, as the wind shrieked through the shutters, Etienne sat beside her on the rug, the fire casting deep shadows across his face. "You're scared," he said gently. Clara nodded, unable to pretend. "So am I." She looked up sharply. "But you're strong." He smiled sadly. "Strength does not mean fearlessness. Strength means doing what must be done, even when every part of you trembles." She swallowed. "Will you have to go?" His pause was answer enough. "But," he added softly, "not yet. And perhaps fate will shift. A letter is not the same as a command." Clara wished she believed that. He continued, "I want you to remember something, Clara. No matter what happens in this winter, no matter what storms rise in Europe, people survive. We endure the cold. We endure hunger. We endure war. It is what our ancestors did, and what we will do. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, listening to the fire crackle, feeling the warmth of the man who had always seemed unbreakable. For the first time, she understood that even the strongest walls could tremble. And outside, the wind carried with it a sound Clara would later remember with chilling clarity. A distant rumble. Not thunder. Not wind. Something heavier. Something marching. Something coming. The winter before the thunder had begun. The cold deepened in the days that followed, sinking into the marrow of France like a slow, inevitable poison. By the second week after the letter arrived, Saint-Marceau had transformed from a quiet farming village into a community holding its breath. There was a sense that the sky itself was waiting for something, just as the people were. Clara Morel sensed the change in every corner of her home. Her father Etienne had become a man of lists. He scribbled notes on scraps of parchment, names, supplies, measurements, and tucked them into pockets, between books, behind jars. He checked the front door latch 3 times before bed. He kept his boots by the hearth as though he expected to be summoned at any moment. Her mother Jacqueline was quieter still. She moved with a deliberate calm, the way someone might walk across a frozen river unsure of how thick the ice truly was. She touched Etienne more often, as if reminding herself he was still there, straightening his scarf, brushing frost from his hair, lingering when she handed him a bowl. Their cottage, once filled with simple laughter and the sounds of ordinary life, was now filled with silences that stretched too long. It was as if the letter had not only been read but had entered the air, settling into the walls, into their breaths, into the very winter pressing upon them. One morning, before the sun had risen, Clara woke to the unmistakable sound of raised voices. Not shouting, her parents never shouted, but firm, urgent voices that cracked with strain. She slipped quietly from her bed and crept down the hallway, bare feet touching the cold floorboards like drops of ice. At the kitchen doorway, she stopped. Etienne stood by the table, gripping its edge so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Jacqueline stood across from him, holding the letter that had arrived days earlier. "You cannot ignore it," she whispered. "I can delay responding," Etienne replied, though even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't true. "Delaying won't change the outcome." Etienne's jaw tightened. There have been false alarms before. Talk, rumors, tensions that blow over with the thaw. "This is different," Jacqueline said softly. "You feel it." "I feel it. Everyone does." Clara sucked in a breath, but the quiet gasp went unnoticed. Etienne ran a hand over his face. He looked suddenly older, as though the cold had carved more lines into him than the years ever had. "When the last war took my brother," he murmured, "my mother said the worst pain was not losing him, it was the waiting before. The knowing and not knowing. I don't want that for her. I don't want that for you." Jacqueline stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on his cheek. "We cannot choose the wind that blows. Only how we brace against it. How can I leave you in Clara? In this cold? With shortages already starting?" His voice broke slightly. Jacqueline pulled him into an embrace. Clara pressed both hands against her mouth, her eyes burning. She didn't want to hear more. She didn't want her father to leave. She didn't want war to matter to her. She slipped away silently, returning to her bed before their voices softened into whispers she could no longer understand. The next day, the village held a small gathering in the church, even though it was not a Sunday. The cold seeped through the old stone walls, but the warmth of bodies made the air inside thick and faintly smoky. Seated on the wooden pews, villagers rubbed their gloved hands, cleared their throats, and avoided one another's eyes. Clara sat between her parents, staring up at the stained glass that showed a lamb standing beneath a shaft of golden light. The colors, emerald, ruby, and sapphire, glowed faintly where the winter sun barely touched them. Father Benoit cleared his throat. He was a short man with silver hair and a beard that made him look kinder than he felt. He was strict about punctuality, strict about scripture, and strict about the noise children made during services. But today, he looked softened, as though the cold had worn down even his sternness. "My children," he began, his voice echoing slightly in the high stone vault, "our nation faces uncertain times. Rumors have reached us, but they remain only that, rumors." A few villagers exchanged doubtful looks. "We must remember," the priest continued, "that fear spreads faster than truth. And faith must stand stronger still." Clara noticed Captain Valier seated near the back. His posture was straight as ever, his eyes fixed ahead, but his fists were clenched on his knees. He was a man who understood conflict in ways the others did not. His tension alone made the air heavier. "Should the time come when France calls upon her sons," Father Benoit said gently, "we must pray they find courage. We must also pray for peace to prevail." Clara felt her father shift beside her. "And we must care for one another," the priest added, "through this winter, through this cold. Community will keep us alive." After the final blessing, the villagers filtered out slowly. Conversations murmured beneath the breath clouds forming in the frigid air. Clara noticed her parents speaking quietly with Captain Valier. His eyes softened slightly when he saw her watching, offering a respectful nod. Still, there was something unspoken in their exchange, words meant to be overheard by no one. Over the next week, letters continued to arrive in Saint Marceau, not always to the Morels, but to many families. Some men grew pale as they unfolded the envelopes. Others pretended bravery for the sake of their wives and children. Some responded quickly. Others, like Etienne, delayed until the last possible day. The snow never stopped. It fell in sheets, in flurries, in thick curtains that turned the sky white. Children no longer played outside. Merchants hauled in their goods early and shut their doors quickly to keep warmth from escaping. Even the animals sensed the change, dogs whined at night, and cows refused to leave their stalls. On the coldest night yet, Clara exhaled near the window and watched her breath freeze into crystals before sinking downward. Frost crawled across the inside of the glass like living lace. Her parents were discussing supplies in the other room, dried beans, barley, salt, firewood. Then suddenly, a knock. Not the polite tapping of a neighbor. A hard, urgent knock that rattled the wood. Her father answered. Clara crept halfway to the doorway, listening. "Etienne," a voice said, Henry's unmistakable voice, low and trembling. "You must come. It's urgent." "What happened?" Etienne asked. "It's Jean-Pierre. He collapsed in the snow outside the mill. We don't know if it was hunger or the cold. Or both." Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her. Jean-Pierre was only 10. Without another word, Etienne grabbed his coat and stepped outside, boots crunching into the thick snow. Clara watched from the doorway as her father and Henri disappeared into the wind. Jacqueline stood behind her, arms wrapped around herself, eyes shining with unshed tears. The cold had claimed another. War had not yet begun, but already it was taking its first victims. Jean-Pierre survived, though barely. The villagers took shifts warming him with blankets and broth, but the incident shook Saint Marceau deeply. "If a boy can be taken," one mother whispered in the bakery line, "what chance do the rest of us have? This cold will not let us see spring," another muttered. "A harsh winter before a harsh year," an elderly man added grimly. Clara felt those words sink into her like needles. Every morning she woke expecting to hear terrible news, of neighbors lost, of borders breached, of armies marching. Every day she watched her father struggle to remain calm. It was on a Thursday when the second letter arrived. This one bore a different seal. A more urgent one. Etienne knew before opening it. Clara knew by the way he held it. Jacqueline knew by the silence that followed. When he finally unfolded the parchment, Clara saw his face collapse inward, like a wall struck by a cannon blast. He set the letter down. Jacqueline steadied herself on the table. Clara felt the room shrink. "It is official," Etienne said, his voice hollow. "I am to report to the regional barracks within 15 days. 15 days. 2 weeks. A breath in the life of winter. A blink in the face of war. Jacqueline pressed a hand to her heart, and Clara took a shaky step backward. The floor felt distant beneath her feet. But, Clara croaked. The village, the cold. Mama and she couldn't finish. Etienne pulled her into his arms. She felt his heart pounding, too fast, too frightened, too human. I did not choose this, he whispered. But I will do everything I can to return. His words held hope, but also something else. Something like a goodbye buried beneath the snow. The following days were unlike any Clara had experienced in her young life. The village came alive with forced energy, men preparing gear, women packing food, children watching with wide, confused eyes. The blacksmith's forge blazed day and night. The baker worked until dawn. Captain Valliere held evening drills in the snow, his voice carrying across the fields like a grim hymn. Etienne spent his time repairing barrels, chopping wood, and organizing food supplies for Jacqueline and Clara. He left nothing to chance. It was as though he feared they would not survive even a week without him. He brought home sacks of dried beans, extra blankets, a new latch for the back door, tools sharpened to perfection. Everything planned. Everything accounted for. Everything except the ache that settled in Clara's chest. One night, as Clara sorted beans by candlelight, she looked up and found her father watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher. Pride, sorrow, love, fear, all tangled together. Come with me, he said quietly. He led her outside. The cold was sharp, slicing through her shawl instantly. Snow glittered beneath the full moon, turning the village into something fragile and silver. Etienne walked toward the vineyard behind their home, where the vines lay buried in frost. He pointed to the horizon. Do you see that star? He asked. A bright solitary star burned above the distant hills, unmoving despite the wind. Clara nodded. When I am away, he said, look to that star. It rises in the same place every night in winter. When you see it, remember that I am under the same sky. Clara's throat tightened painfully. But the sky cannot protect you, she whispered. No, he said softly. But love can. She threw her arms around him, burying her face in his coat, inhaling the scent of wood smoke and leather that had always meant safety. He held her tightly, as though memorizing the shape of her. The moon watched silently. So did the winter. On the morning of the 10th day after the second letter, the wind changed. Not warmer, never warmer. But sharper. Faster. As though something large was pushing it forward. Clara felt it the moment she stepped outside. The air felt thinner. The world quieter. And a sound whispered through the village, barely perceptible, but unmistakable to anyone who had ever lived near borders touched by war. Distant thunder. Not from the sky. From the earth. Cannon tests. Or troop movement. Or something worse. The adults did not speak of it openly. But that night, when Clara lay awake in her bed, she realized the truth. The world was shifting beneath her feet, and nothing would ever go back to the way it had been. War had not yet scattered their village. But it had already entered their hearts. Already entered their days. Already entered their dreams. The countdown to Etienne's departure had begun. And the winter showed no mercy. Not to soldiers. Not to families. Not to children. Not to hope. The wind that blew over France now carried more than snow. It carried destiny. The sky above Saint Marceau thickened into a single, unbroken sheet of gray that seemed to press down on the village, smothering it with a weight beyond snow. For 15 days, those 15 cold, shrinking days that stood between Etienne Morel and the barracks, time itself seemed frozen, suspended like an icicle too fragile to touch yet too threatening to ignore. Each morning began with the sound of wind scraping along rooftops like a giant fingernail. It crept through cracks in the shutters, sighed through the gaps in doorframes, and found its way into every corner of the Morel home. Clara woke each day wrapped in layers of blankets, yet still the cold seeped into her bones as if the winter were trying to claim her inch by inch. Her father woke earlier, before anyone else. He would stand outside in the pre-dawn stillness, the snow crunching beneath his boots, staring toward the distant hills where the barracks lay hidden from view. Sometimes, Clara watched him through the window, his silhouette stark against the pale horizon, broad shoulders weighed down by more than snow, his breath rising like clouds that disappeared too quickly. He never spoke during those moments. He didn't need to. Inside the cottage, preparations became a daily ritual. Not frantic, not rushed, just steady, purposeful, relentless. Like a heartbeat counting down. Etienne repaired the front fence so Jacqueline and Clara would have a protected path to the well. He reinforced the barn door, patching a gap where wind had carved through the wood. He made lists, so many lists, and hung them by the kitchen shelf. Firewood, daily count. Dried beans, ration carefully. Keep lantern oil covered. Salt in the high cabinet. Clara must not go to the creek after dusk. Check roof after every storm. Clara read them every morning. They were little pieces of her father, written in hurried strokes, trying to stay behind even when he could not. On the third morning, she found him kneeling by the hearth, carefully cleaning the old pocket watch that had belonged to his father. He wound it slowly, wiped the glass face with a soft cloth, then held it out to her. "For me?" she whispered. "For when time feels too still," he said. The watch ticked softly in her hands. "Even in winter," he added, "time moves forward. Even when we cannot feel it." Clara blinked back tears. She did not want time to move forward. She wanted the days to freeze forever. The village had changed too. The square, once a place where children played and women traded news, was now a crossroads for worried conversations whispered behind scarves pulled high against the cold. On the fifth day, a new bulletin was posted on the board near the bakery. Clara watched as a crowd gathered, breath smoking in the air like small ghosts. "It says the border tensions have worsened," whispered a woman clutching a loaf of bread. "Artillery has been moved to the eastern ridge," a man added with dread. "My son is already at the camp," murmured another woman, eyes wet. "He wrote that the cold is worse there than here." Captain Valliere walked across the square then, his boots leaving sharp impressions in the snow. He paused before the bulletin, read it silently, then turned to the crowd. "All families with summoned men should prepare," he said. "The nation will ask for their strength." Clara felt the words settle over the village like fresh snow, quiet, cold, heavy. When she returned home and told her parents, her mother simply nodded, as though she had expected the news. Her father looked at the floor. The nights were the hardest. The cottage was warm enough near the hearth, but the world outside felt too close, too cold, too alive with the whispers of war. Sometimes Clara heard distant cracks, perhaps trees splitting under the cold, perhaps thunder from the hills, or perhaps something else entirely. On the seventh night, Clara had trouble sleeping. She tossed beneath her blankets, listening to the wind screaming against the walls like a creature locked outside. When she could no longer bear it, she slipped out of bed and padded into the main room. Her father sat by the fire, staring into the flames. "You are awake," he said softly. "So are you." He smiled faintly. "Come here." She curled beside him on the floor, the warmth from the fire brushing her chilled cheeks. "What frightens you the most?" she whispered. He stared into the embers for a long moment. "Leaving you and your mother in this cold," he said. "Leaving you with too little wood. Too little food. Too much winter." "But you prepared everything," she said. "Yes," he replied. "But no preparation replaces a man's hands." Clara reached for his sleeve. "Then come back. Come back quickly." He looked at her with eyes more tired than she had ever seen. "I will return," he said. "As long as the world allows it." She wished he hadn't said the last part. It made the room feel colder. On the 10th day, a blizzard swept across Saint-Marceau with terrifying force. Snow fell so thickly that houses seemed to disappear into white shadows. The wind whistled like 100 flutes, screaming against shutters, rattling doors, lifting powdery drifts into violent spirals that scraped across windows like claws. The Morels stayed inside, huddled around the hearth, listening to the storm tear at the world. At one point, the lantern flickered dangerously. Clara gasped. "It's all right," Etienne said, steadying the wick. "It will hold." A loud crack echoed through the house. Something had fallen outside. "What was that?" Jacqueline whispered. "Probably a branch," Etienne replied. But his eyes betrayed uncertainty. When the storm finally eased near dawn, Etienne bundled himself in layers and stepped outside to inspect the damage while Clara and her mother waited anxiously. He returned with snow covering his shoulders like a cloak. "The old pine behind the barn split," he said. "Half of it collapsed. But the roof is still intact." Clara shivered. Every new strain of winter felt like a warning. "How many days left?" she asked quietly. 5. The number tasted bitter in her mouth. On the 11th day, Etienne gathered Clara early in the morning. "I need your help today," he said. "We are going into the forest." She blinked. "The forest? With all this snow?" He nodded. "We need firewood that is dry enough to burn. Anything close to the village has already been taken." Clara bundled herself quickly, though her hands shook slightly. They walked together through paths nearly hidden under snow, branches sagging low with frost, the silence so thick it felt dangerous. The air was sharp, biting at their faces with every breath. "How will we carry wood this far?" Clara asked. "I marked a place earlier," he replied. "It will be enough for the worst days." They reached a cluster of fallen trees sheltered beneath a rocky overhang. The wood there was dry enough. Etienne worked with calm efficiency, chopping pieces to manageable size. Clara gathered them into a bundle, though the weight was more than she expected. "You are strong," he said, noticing her struggle. "No," she said honestly. "But I am trying to be." "That is what strength truly is," he replied. When they returned to the village, Clara saw neighbors doing the same, gathering what the forest could spare, eyes sunken from cold and fear. Winter had pushed every family to its limits. But it was the 12th day when the mood shifted from struggle to surrender. Because by the 12th day, the men of the village began saying their early goodbyes. It was not organized. It was not announced. It simply happened, like the drift of snow beginning to melt beneath a weak sun. Men walked from house to house, giving warm handshakes, sharing quiet words. Women stood in doorways, clutching shawls to their chests. Children stared, wide-eyed, sensing the heaviness even if they did not understand it. Clara watched neighbors embrace in slow, trembling hugs. She saw Madame Lachaude press her forehead to her husband's chest, tears falling silently while he held her close. She saw old Monsieur Delorme sit on a bench outside his cottage, holding his son's hands tightly, speaking words only the two of them could hear. She saw Captain Valliere moving down the street with authority, checking lists, speaking quickly, organizing departures. The village felt like a heart beating too fast. When Clara and her mother stepped outside, several women approached Jacqueline. "If you need anything," one of them said, "my home is open." "We will help one another," another added. Jacqueline nodded, but her expression was far away. Clara looked at her father. "When will you say goodbye to others?" she asked. "I will do that on the last day," he replied. "Today is for you and your mother." The way he said it made her throat ache. On the 13th day, the snow stopped. Not because the cold had relented, but because the clouds had emptied everything they had. The air felt strangely still, and the world outside appeared frozen in place, every branch heavy with frost, every path buried, every rooftop a sculpted mound of white. It was the quietest morning Saint Marceau had seen all winter. Clara walked outside with her father, their boots sinking deep into the fresh drifts. The sky was a pale silver, soft and muted, as if afraid to disturb the village before the inevitable. Etienne took her to the crest of the small hill where the vineyard lay sleeping under snow. "Tomorrow," he said, "I will pack. And the day after that." I will leave. Clara looked up at him, fear and love swirling inside her like two storms colliding. Will you be cold at the barracks? She asked. Yes, he said honestly. But I will manage. Will they have enough food? I will manage. Will it be dangerous? He hesitated. And that hesitation said everything. Clara looked at her boots, eyes burning. Her father kneeled in the snow, taking her hands. Clara, he said softly, you and your mother are my strength. I go because I must. But I fight to return. She nodded, though tears ran unchecked down her cheeks. He wiped them gently with his thumb. When you feel afraid, he said, remember the star. She looked up at the pale afternoon sky. No stars, not yet. But she believed one waited there. Somewhere. On the 14th day, the last full day before departure, the village gathered at the church again, not for mass but for warmth, for comfort, for the simple need to be together. Father Benoit lit every candle he had, filling the stone interior with soft amber light. The air was still cold, but less so with so many bodies huddled close. Clara sat between her parents once more, listening as whispered prayers floated around her like drifting snowflakes. After a quiet moment, the priest spoke softly. When tomorrow comes, we will send our sons, our brothers, and our husbands with blessings. Let peace find them. Let courage guide them. And let this village remain a sanctuary for those who wait. Clara felt her father squeeze her hand. When they walked home through the dusk, lanterns glowed in every window of the village, small flames fighting against the darkness. As if no one wanted the night to swallow their hope. The 15th day arrived with a sky of cold blue glass. Etienne rose before dawn. He packed slowly, methodically, folding the few clothes he would bring, adding dried rations, sharpening his knife, checking his flint, placing the pocket watch he had kept for years into a small pouch. Clara and Jacqueline prepared breakfast, though none of them ate much. When the final moment came, it came quietly. No drums. No trumpets. Just 3 sets of footsteps crunching in the snow as they walked toward the village crossroads where the other men were gathering. Clara held her father's arm tightly. Jacqueline walked beside them, her eyes shining. At the crossroads, Captain Valliere stood tall, calling out names, marking each arrival. One by one, men embraced their families. One by one, families let go. When Etienne's name was called, he knelt before Clara. Keep the watch safe. She nodded, tears spilling again. Look for the star. I will. He embraced her tightly, lifting her slightly off the ground, then set her down gently. He kissed Jacqueline's forehead. Her hands clung to him for a heartbeat too long. Then he stepped back. And then, he turned. And walked toward the line of men forming in the snow. Clara watched his figure grow smaller with every step. Her breath trembled in the frozen air. Her heart felt like the cold had reached it at last. When he disappeared over the distant bend in the road, she whispered into the wind. Come back. But the winter carried her words away. The snow had thickened by the hour, falling in layers so heavy that the world seemed carved from chalk-white silence. By the time Etienne and Clara reached the outskirts of Verdun, the afternoon sky had dimmed into a pale bluish fog. Their boots sank deep into the cold ground, leaving behind a trail that looked fragile, as though the wind could erase their existence with a single breath. Verdun, usually a place of lively markets and marching boots, now felt deserted, like the city was holding its breath against something enormous creeping in from the horizon. The towers of the old citadel rose like ghosts through the falling snow, their outlines softened by frost. Clara tightened her scarf. Papa, is this where the soldiers gather? Etienne exhaled slowly. Yes. All roads from the western villages lead here. Orders tend to find their roots in this place. Clara could hear the unease in his voice. She had always thought of her father as unshakable, able to mend roofs during storms, chase wolves from fields, and still smile through the hardships of farm life. But now his shoulders carried a weight she had never seen before. They approached a wide crossroad where 4 frozen paths intersected, marked only by an old wooden post half buried in snow. A military checkpoint stood nearby, little more than 2 tents and a cart sheltered under planks. 3 soldiers huddled close to a lantern, the flames struggling to stay alive in the wind. One soldier lifted his head. "Halt. Identify yourselves." Etienne stepped forward. "Etienne Morel of Saint-Marceau. I was summoned." The soldier nodded but frowned when his gaze fell upon Clara. "And the girl?" Etienne hesitated. "My daughter. She. I came to bring him warm clothes," Clara interrupted quickly, forcing a smile. "Papa falls sick easily in the cold." Etienne shot her a warning look, but she held firm. The soldier sighed. "Very well. But she must stay behind the line. No exceptions." Behind them, the snow swirled harder, wind tugging Clara's coat like a child begging her to run back home. But she remained still. She refused to turn back. They were led toward a cluster of old farmhouses that had been repurposed into temporary barracks. Smoke rose from their chimneys, twisting upward into the dim sky. Clara could hear the muffled murmurs of soldiers, the scrape of boots on frozen earth, the low hum of exhaustion that hung over the camp like fog. Inside one of the barns, transformed into a command shelter, Etienne was asked to wait. Clara lingered near the doorway, watching through a narrow crack as officers spoke in sharp whispers. "Troops from the east are advancing. We cannot afford delays. Even farmers must march." The words pricked Clara's heart like icy needles. Etienne emerged moments later, his face drawn. "Clara. I must leave tonight." Her breath caught. "Tonight? But the snow, it's dangerous. And I followed you so you wouldn't be alone." He placed his hands on her shoulders, eyes soft with fatherly sorrow. "My brave girl, you shouldn't have come all this way. I cannot take you where I am going. But I can stay with you until sunrise," Clara pleaded. "Just until then, please." Etienne looked away, torn between duty and love. "Only until sunrise," he whispered. They spent the evening in the corner of the barn, seated on sacks of grain as soldiers around them cleaned rifles, wrote letters, or stared quietly at nothing. The world outside howled with snow, but inside, Clara rested her head against her father's shoulder, feeling the tremble he tried to hide. "Papa," she murmured, "do you think Allah will protect you?" Etienne did not answer immediately. Instead, he lifted Clara's chin gently. "Allah protects the brave," he said softly. "And right now, you are the bravest soul I know." Clara swallowed back tears. "Then bring that bravery with you, Papa. Bring it wherever the road leads." Hours passed. The lanterns dimmed. The wind roared on. But it was just before dawn, when the world was coated in a fragile silver glow, that everything changed. A horn sounded. Boots thundered. Orders echoed through the barn. Etienne stood, pulling his thick coat over his shoulders. Clara rose quickly. "Papa." He embraced her tightly, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Remember our vineyard behind the house?" he whispered. "When winter ends, go there. The first blossom always shows us hope." She clung to his sleeve. "Then come home to see it. Promise me." He did not promise. He could not. Instead, he smiled the smallest, saddest smile she had ever seen. When he joined the marching column outside, snow falling like ashes, Clara followed him to the frozen crossroads where the soldiers gathered. "Go back to Saint-Marceau," he called over the wind. "Tell your mother I am safe. But you, Clara," he said, his voice steady, "if you stay here, I will not be able to walk forward." The line began to move. Etienne turned away, becoming one figure among hundreds. Step by step, he faded into the white curtain of snow, swallowed by the morning fog. Clara stood alone at the crossroads, the wind numbing her cheeks, tears freezing on her lashes. She whispered into the swirling air, "Please, bring him home." And far beyond the hills, thunder rumbled, soft, distant, but unmistakable. the first true sound of war. The sky that night was a sheet of unbroken silver, glowing faintly as if the moon were hiding behind layers of frozen cloud. Clara had stayed at the edge of Verdun long after her father's silhouette vanished. Now, with her breath turning to crystals in the air, she felt the cold working its way through her boots, her coat, and finally into her bones. Yet she did not move. For a long time, Clara simply stared into the white emptiness where Etienne had marched, hoping foolishly that he might turn around, realize she still needed him, and run back. But the soldiers had marched with a frightening discipline. Not one had looked over their shoulder. Not even her father. When the last echo of boots sank into the snow, Clara finally turned toward Verdun. A frozen wind whipped against her cheeks as she trudged back to the makeshift camp. Some soldiers, exhausted from the preparations, sat slumped against walls or leaned over steaming cups of weak broth. No one noticed the small girl walking among them with hollow eyes. She stopped outside the old barn where she and Etienne had spent the evening. The lantern inside had been extinguished. Only dying embers glowed in the hearth, casting long trembling shadows across the wooden beams. The remaining soldiers spoke in low tones. Orders are accelerating. Rumor says the Eastern Front is already moving. Another storm is coming tonight. Clara listened, unmoving. A storm. As if the cold could grow any worse. She approached a corner where a stray blanket lay abandoned. She picked it up, wrapped it around herself, and settled onto a bale of hay. For the first time since leaving Saint Marceau, she realized her hands were shaking uncontrollably. But she was not crying. Not yet. She wanted to. Every piece of her chest felt cracked, fragile like ice over a river. But somehow, no tears came. As if the cold had stolen even that. Outside, the wind sharpened. Snow scurried against the barn door. Clara closed her eyes, letting exhaustion pull her into a half-sleep. That was when she heard it. A distant rumble. Soft at first, almost gentle, like someone dragging a wooden crate across stone. But slowly it grew deeper, stronger, until the very hay beneath her vibrated. Clara's eyes snapped open. "Earthquake?" she whispered, though she knew that wasn't it. The soldiers around her froze as well. One stood abruptly. "That's cannon fire." The barn fell into utter silence. They all listened. The rumble faded, then came again, firmer this time. It was far away, perhaps miles, but unmistakable. The storm was not the only thing moving toward Verdun. One soldier cursed under his breath. Another darted outside to confirm. Clara followed quietly, stopping at the doorway. The world was a curtain of white. The snowstorm that had arrived seemed almost alive, swirling with purpose rather than chaos. The wind moaned like an old, wounded beast. Through that curtain, faint orange pulses flickered far off in the night sky. Like distant lightning. Only lightning did not strike the same place multiple times. Clara's heart dropped. The war wasn't waiting. It was already coming. A hand suddenly touched her shoulder. She flinched, then saw it was an old nurse, wrapped in 3 layers of wool shawls. Her eyes were gentle, though her face bore deep lines of fatigue. "Child, what are you doing awake in this storm?" the nurse asked. Clara swallowed. Her voice trembled. "My father marched tonight. I wanted to stay close." The nurse studied her with quiet understanding. "Come with me. The cold will kill you faster than fear." Inside a smaller cottage beside the barn, the nurse lit a candle. The room smelled faintly of herbs and smoldering wood. She handed Clara a cup of hot water, no tea, just warmth. "Drink," she said. "It tricks the body into believing it is safe." Clara held the cup with both hands. The heat seared her palms at first, then slowly seeped in. "War takes everything from grown men," the nurse murmured. "But from children, it steals even more." Clara's eyes lowered to the steam swirling above her cup. After a long silence, she whispered, "Will Papa come back?" The nurse paused. Her face softened. I have seen many men march to battles, she said carefully. Some return with joy. Some return with sorrow. And some, she hesitated. Some live on only in the stories their families carry. Clara's breath stopped. The candlelight trembled between them. But your father, the nurse continued softly, walked with purpose. That matters. Men like him, they find a way. The words were gentle, but Clara sensed the nurse was telling only half of the truth, and trying to protect her from the other half. Still, the warmth was enough to loosen something inside her chest. And finally, her tears came. Silent, one by one, dripping into the cup she held. The nurse placed a hand on her back as she sobbed softly, the sound almost lost to the storm roaring outside. After a time, the tears slowed. Clara wiped her face. What should I do now? The nurse leaned closer. Children who wander alone in times like these disappear into the snow. Stay here until dawn. Then decide. Clara nodded weakly. Exhaustion pulled at her again. The nurse laid a thick wool blanket over her shoulders and guided her to a corner bed. Clara curled into it, listening to the storm batter the walls. The candle dimmed. The cold whispered at the windows. The distant thunder continued, steady as a heartbeat. And somewhere far beyond Verdun, beyond frozen valleys and silent forests, her father marched into the unknown, one footstep after another, swallowed by darkness and snow. Clara pressed the blanket closer. Papa, please hear me, she murmured into the darkness. The snow is listening. I hope it carries my voice. Then, finally, she drifted into sleep. But just before she did, she thought she heard something. Not thunder. Not wind. A voice. Her father's voice. Calling her name. Or was it only a dream? The storm did not answer. And the night swallowed her gently, like a lullaby woven from sorrow. The morning of January 18, 1898, began with a silence so complete that it felt unnatural, as if the world itself had paused in anticipation of something dreadful. Snow had fallen through the night in thick, merciless sheets, covering the small French village of Saint-Lys in layers that reached the knees. The rooftops sagged beneath their frozen burden, chimneys puffed weak swirls of pale smoke, and every step on the ground produced the sound of ice cracking like broken porcelain. Alara Aubert woke with the uneasy sensation that she had already lived through this morning in a dream. The same numb cold was biting her fingertips, the same dread pooling in her stomach, and the same faint ringing in her ears, an ominous echo that hinted at distant artillery. She pushed aside the threadbare blanket covering her and rose, the wooden floor stinging her bare feet like sharp needles of frost. Her younger brother, Lucien, was curled in front of the dying hearth fire. His small frame was wrapped in two coats that did little against the cold. Alara knelt beside him, brushing a strand of hair from his cheek. You should have slept in the bed, Luke, she murmured. He stirred, but did not wake. The war had taken much from Saint-Lys, its men, its food supplies, its sense of safety, but the cold winter of 1898 was taking even more. Frostbite and starvation had become as common as the distant thunder of cannons from the northern front. Alara moved to the single window of their cottage. She wiped the frost from the glass and looked outside. The sky did not look normal. A heavy gray dome stretched across the horizon, swirling as if painted by a trembling hand. Snowflakes drifted slowly, almost theatrically, turning as they fell, each one seeming larger than the last. The cold felt alive, almost conscious. Old Madame Rousseau had whispered just days earlier that winters like this came only when the land was mourning. Perhaps she had been right. The village gathers. By midday, the villagers gathered in the central square near the frozen fountain. People walked hunched, wrapped in mismatched scraps of cloth and leather. Their faces were pale, not only from cold but from the accumulated shock of loss. Every family had someone missing, someone fighting, someone buried. A horse-drawn wagon creaked into the square, carrying the elderly Mayor Everard Fontaine, his once vibrant voice now reduced to brittle breaths. He raised a frail hand. Listen, all of you, he said, coughing between each word. A message has arrived from the Southern Command. Supplies, bread, medicine, blankets, are coming from Toulouse, but they will not reach us unless a path is cleared through the mountain pass. The snow has buried the old road. A murmur rippled through the villagers. They were too cold, too hungry, too exhausted even to protest. Alara stepped forward. "We can clear it," she said, though the idea seemed impossible even as she spoke. Mayor Fontaine looked at her with tired eyes. "You are brave, mademoiselle, but the pass is dangerous." With this weather, he shook his head. "If we don't try," Alara replied, "people will die here before the supplies ever arrive." The crowd lowered their heads. That was the truth no one wished to say aloud. A man approached, Etienne Marchand, a former blacksmith whose broad shoulders still retained the strength of his old trade. He carried an axe strapped to his back. "I will go," Etienne said. "And I will take anyone willing to follow." For others reluctantly stepped forward. Alara joined them. Lucien grabbed her coat sleeve. "Alara, no. It's too cold. And the soldier said there are wolves near the pass." She knelt. "If I don't go, we won't survive many more days. Stay with Madame Rousseau. Keep warm. I will return." But the sky darkened as she said the words, swallowing her promise in a shiver of wind. The journey to the pass. The group left the village just after noon, dragging shovels, axes, and ropes. The snow deepened with each step until their knees vanished beneath it. The trees surrounding them bent under icy weight, branches cracking like gunfire. Etienne led them along an overgrown trail. "Stay close. The wind is changing. Storm's coming." Indeed, the air carried a warning, a low hum that grew louder the farther they walked. It was not wind. It was not thunder. It was something worse. Alara stopped. "Do you hear that?" Etienne frowned. "Artillery. From the front." Alara's throat tightened. The fighting had come closer. Too close. Minutes later, they reached the mouth of the mountain pass. The sight drained the color from their faces. The entire path was buried beneath an avalanche, massive boulders of snow and broken trees that had slid from the cliffs above, creating a wall nearly 3 meters high. Etienne exhaled slowly. "Build fires. We will be here for hours." They began hacking at the snow, carving a narrow trench. The cold quickly seeped into their bones. Snowflakes clung to eyelashes. Their breaths turned shallow. Time passed. The trench grew slowly, painfully slowly. But then came the sound. A distant, hollow roar. Like the sky inhaling. Alara froze, shovel still in hand. "What is that?" A gust of wind slammed into them, knocking one man to the ground. Snow whipped sideways, stinging their skin. Etienne shouted something, but the wind devoured his words. Then, above them, a crack. Another. The sound of shifting snow. Etienne's eyes widened. "Run!" But the avalanche had already begun. The sky falls. Alara dove behind a fallen pine trunk as the mountainside collapsed in a thunderous wave. Snow poured like a collapsing white ocean, swallowing the path, the trench, and 2 of the men who had no time to scream. Etienne grabbed Alara's arm and pulled her to her feet. "We have to move. Now." They stumbled uphill, slipping, scrambling, crawling. The wind howled like a living beast. Another wave of snow crashed down, edging closer with terrifying speed. Alara turned and saw Etienne fall. His leg had sunk into a hidden crevice. "Go," he shouted. "Don't look back." But she dropped to her knees and clawed at the snow around his leg. The cold bit her skin. Her fingers went numb. Etienne cursed. "You stubborn girl." One final pull, and his leg came free. They ran. The avalanche roared behind them. But a protruding rock ledge shielded them as the snow cascaded past like a frozen waterfall. By the time the chaos ceased, the sky had dimmed into a ferocious twilight. Two of their companions were gone, buried beneath the mountain. The pass was worse than before. Alara's breath trembled. We failed. Etienne leaned against a tree, chest heaving. No, not yet. The storm will settle by morning. We start again. But the night had plans of its own. The brink of despair. They built a shelter beneath the rock ledge, using branches and a torn blanket. The wind gnawed at every gap. The fire barely held. Etienne stared into the flames. Do you know what war does to a land, Alara? She shook her head. It freezes it, he whispered. Not just the rivers or the roads, people's hearts. Their hope. Their futures. Alara pulled her coat tighter. We can't let it. They sat in silence as the storm raged outside. The fire flickered weakly, as if tired of living. Hours passed. Alara closed her eyes, exhausted. But a faint sound woke her. Crunch. Crunch. Snow being stepped on. Her heart stopped. Etienne, she whispered. He reached for the axe. Stay behind me. Figures emerged from the white darkness, 5 shadows, moving slowly, hunched against the wind. Soldiers. French soldiers. Their uniforms were torn, stained with blood and mud. Their faces carried the hollow stare of men who had seen too much. Their captain stepped forward. We lost our unit, he said hoarsely. We saw your fire. We mean no harm. Please, warmth. Etienne lowered the axe. The captain collapsed to his knees. The others followed, trembling uncontrollably. Alara handed them what little dry cloth they had, helping wrap their hands, rubbing warmth into their frozen skin. Tell me, Etienne said quietly, how bad is the front? The captain looked up, eyes glassy. Worse than anyone knows. Villages burned. Roads gone. And, his voice cracked. The enemy is pushing south. Etienne paled. That means... Yes. The soldier swallowed hard. Your village is in danger. And the supplies will never reach you if the pass stays buried. The fire hissed in the cold silence. Alara clenched her fists. They had no time left. The decision. At dawn, the storm passed. The sky turned a pale silver. Snow covered everything again. The soldiers were too weak to travel. Etienne insisted on staying with them. But Alara stood at the edge of the cliff, staring at the ruined path. Lucien. Madame Rousseau. Her village. She could not return without help. Without supplies. Without hope. The captain approached her. There is another path, he whispered. Dangerous. Steep. Hardly a path at all. But it leads south, to Toulouse. Alara turned. How far? 2 days. If the weather holds. 2 days. Alone. Through cliffs, wolves, and frost. But she nodded. Etienne grabbed her arm. You won't survive. I have to try. He closed his eyes, defeated. Then take this. He handed her the axe. And don't look back. Alara stepped onto the narrow ridge. The wind tugged at her coat like ghostly fingers. The path ahead was white, endless, unforgiving. She inhaled sharply. Then she walked. 1 step. Another. Then another. Toward the unknown. Toward salvation or death. The sky above rumbled softly, as if watching. And so began her most perilous journey yet, one that would decide the fate of Saintless. The ridge path was narrower than anything Alara had ever walked in her life, no wider than the length of her foot, winding along a cliff that fell sharply into an abyss of white mist. The wind whispered in cold tongues, curling around her body as if trying to pull her into the void. Snowflakes floated lazily, but each one stung her skin like tiny shards of ice. Alara tightened the straps of her worn boots. The axe Etienne had given her hung at her side, its handle already crusted with frost. Below her, the world stretched in a vast expanse of frozen silence, endless white hills, skeletal forests, and abandoned farmlands. The war had drained these lands of life, leaving behind only the bones of once prosperous villages. She whispered into the wind, "Hold on, Lucien. I'm coming back." The wind did not answer. The ghosts of the valley. By midday the sky dimmed into a pale grey dome. Shadows of clouds drifted across the snow like wandering spirits. Alara descended from the ridge into a valley where the trees grew thicker, their branches bowed under the weight of ice. The quiet was unsettling, too still, too heavy. Only once did she pause. Not far from the path lay the remnants of a small encampment, half-buried tents, scattered boots, a rusted pan. Snow had softened the shape of a human form lying under a tree, a rifle still clutched in stiff fingers. Alara stood still. A soldier. Long dead. His uniform was unrecognizable beneath the frost, but the insignia barely visible on his collar told her he had belonged to a French regiment. "May Allah grant you peace," she murmured, touching her chest with trembling fingers. She forced herself forward. She could not afford grief. Not now. Yet the ghosts of the valley followed her, every snapped twig, every shifting shadow, every echo of her footsteps in the snow made her heart leap. Hours passed, and the cold seeped deeper into her bones. The return of the howling wind. The wind returned with a vengeance that afternoon, no longer whispering but screaming. Snow blew sideways, clawing at her coat and scarf. White out. She dropped to her knees and dug her fingers into the snow to keep from being thrown off balance. The ridge behind her had already vanished in the swirling storm. Every direction looked the same. Infinite white. Her breath grew ragged. Panic tugged at her throat. No, not here, not now. But suffocating fear rose inside her. What if she had lost the path? What if the storm buried her like it had buried the pass? What if her frozen body would be found weeks later, or never found at all? She squeezed her eyes shut. Then a voice seemed to whisper through the storm. "Alara." Her eyes snapped open. "Lucien," she breathed. But there was only wind. "Alara." The voice again, softer than snow. She spun around. "Who's there?" Out of the white blur emerged a dim glow, a lantern. Her knees weakened with relief. A man stepped into view, wrapped in a heavy coat, snow clinging to his beard. "Are you lost?" he called. She blinked, unsure if he was real. I'm trying to reach Toulouse. The village, Saint-Lys, needs supplies. The pass closed." The soldier said. He lifted the lantern higher. "You're far from the main road. Come. There is shelter." She hesitated. Shelter meant warmth, but it could also mean danger. Bandits roamed the countryside, preying on the desperate. But then she saw his eyes, gentle, tired, worn down by winter just as she was. She stood. "Lead the way," she whispered. "The huntsman's cabin." They reached a small log cabin nestled between two ancient pine trees. Smoke drifted lightly from the chimney. A wooden fence half buried in snow marked the property. The man pushed open the door, revealing a crackling fire inside. The warmth hit her like a shock. She nearly collapsed. "Sit," he instructed. "Warm yourself. I'll fetch water." Alara sank onto a wooden stool near the fire. The heat stung her fingertips as sensation returned. Her cheeks burned. After a moment, the man returned with a pot of melted snow. He set it beside the fire and stirred it with a spoon. "My name is Armand," he said. "I am a trapper. Been living here for 20 years. "Alara," she replied weakly. "Thank you for helping me." He nodded and handed her a cup of warm water. "You're headed to Toulouse, you say? That's a long road for a girl alone." "My village will die if I turn back," she said. "The war, the cold, everyone is starving. I have to reach the city." Armand studied her face with an expression somewhere between admiration and pity. You have courage. But courage won't keep you alive out there. The wolves roam the lower forests at night. And the storm will return. I'll leave at dawn, Elara insisted. I cannot waste time. He sighed, then reached into a cabinet and pulled out a wool cloak, thick, heavy, and lined with fur. Take this. No, she protested. I can't. You will freeze without it, he said simply. She bowed her head and accepted it. The night of truth. The storm raged outside as night fell. The walls of the cabin groaned beneath the wind. Elara wrapped herself in the cloak and listened to the howl of winter beasts roaming the trees. Armand sat sharpening a hunting knife. Elara, he said quietly, why do you care so much? Plenty of people have given up already. She stared into the fire. Because if I give up, Lucien has no one. Armand nodded slowly. Later, when she tried to sleep on the wooden cot by the wall, her mind refused to rest. She kept seeing the avalanche. The soldiers' hollow eyes. The trench filled with snow. Etienne shouting her name. Why had she lived when others died? She did not know. But dawn would come soon, and with it another battle. She eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep. The wolf moon. She woke before sunrise. The storm had ceased, replaced by an eerie stillness. Armand was already awake, fastening a thick hunting belt. I'll walk with you, he said. At least until the southern ridge. You don't have to. I know. They stepped outside. The moon hung low, pale and enormous, casting silver light across the snow. The sky was cloudless for the first time in days. It was beautiful. But also frightening, too quiet. They trekked down the hillside. The snow was deeper than before, rising almost to Elara's thighs. Each step was a battle. Suddenly, a howl. Long. Low. Close. Elara stopped. Armand reached for his rifle. They've been hungry all winter. Another howl answered from the left. Then another behind them. Elara's heart began to pound. Stay beside me, Armand whispered. From the tree line emerged the first wolf, gray fur blending with the snow, eyes glowing like yellow fire. Two more appeared behind it. A pack. Elara tightened her grip on the axe. The wolves spread out, circling. Armand raised the rifle. The alpha wolf lunged. The gunshot shattered the silence. Snow erupted. The wolf fell. But the pack did not retreat. Armand shouted, "Run!" They sprinted through the snow, stumbling, slipping. The wolves gave chase, growling, snarling, breath steaming in the cold air. Elara swung the axe wildly behind her as one wolf leaped. The blade grazed its side, sending it tumbling. But another lunged for her leg. Armand tackled it, slashing with his knife. Elara! The ridge! Go! She hesitated, torn between survival and abandoning her rescuer. Go, he screamed again. Tears froze on her lashes. She ran. The ridge came into view, a narrow path leading toward the southern plains. Behind her, wolves snarled. Armand roared in pain. Elara, he bellowed, voice fading, don't let them die. And then the snarls drowned his voice. Elara collapsed at the ridge's edge, sobbing, the axe slipping from her numb fingers. He had saved her. Another ghost added to the snow. She forced herself to stand. She had no right to stop now. The city of salvation. By late afternoon, the land began to change. The snow thinned. The wind softened. Wooden fences appeared along the road. Smoke rose from distant chimneys. And then, like a dream, the walls of Toulouse loomed ahead. Elara fell to her knees in relief, tears streaming down her frozen cheeks. She had made it. She crawled the final meters to the gate, where two guards rushed toward her. Miss, are you hurt? Where have you come from? Her lips trembled. Saintless, needs help, supplies, the pass, gone, please. The guards exchanged horrified glances. Within minutes, she was taken inside, wrapped in blankets, offered broth, and surrounded by officers eager to hear her story. A commander with a thick mustache knelt beside her. Your village lives because you survived that journey, he said softly. We will send aid immediately. Alara closed her eyes. She wanted to sleep for days. But all she managed was a whisper. Thank you. The return through the white silence. Supplies were loaded onto horse-drawn wagons, bread, medicine, blankets, kerosene. Soldiers armed with rifles volunteered to escort the convoy north. Alara insisted on returning with them. No, the commander protested. You've done enough. Rest. I'm going, she said, voice steady. My brother is waiting. The journey back was easier. The storm had passed. The wolves were gone. But the weight of loss pressed against her heart like an iron chain. They passed the ridge where Armand had died. The snow was stained faintly brown. Alara bowed her head. May Allah grant you peace, she whispered again. They pressed on. The home that refused to die. On the third day, the snowy rooftops of Saintless appeared on the horizon. Villagers rushed out, thin, pale, desperate. When Lucien saw her, he ran forward, stumbling through the snow. Alara! Alara! She fell to her knees as he threw his arms around her. You came back, he sobbed into her coat. I knew you would. Alara held him tightly, tears spilling freely. I promised. Mayor Fontaine approached, astonished as soldiers began unloading supplies. How did you manage this? He whispered. Alara looked up at the gray sky. People helped me, she said softly. People who didn't have to. The villagers gathered, hands shaking as they received bread and blankets. Children smiled again. Old men cried openly. Saintless would survive. Because she had not given up. Because she had walked the road of silver ghosts. Epilogue, the first thaw. 2 weeks later, the first patch of brown earth appeared beneath the melting snow. The worst winter in memory was finally breaking. Alara stood on the hill overlooking Saintless. The village still bore scars, broken fences, abandoned homes, soot-blackened chimneys, but it lived. Lucien approached her, slipping his small hand into hers. Alara? Yes? Will things get better now? She looked at the sky. The clouds were parting, revealing the faintest touch of blue. Yes, she whispered. Slowly. But yes. And for the first time in months, the future did not feel like a frozen battlefield. It felt like spring.